Three. The first one, unfortunately, Rosemary Bancroft-Marcus is unable to attend now. There are only four things I now know that link Belgium as a country: the monarchy, beer, football, and I now learn train strikes. So she hasn't been able to make it from that fair country today. And the result is that I have to invest myself in the mantle of learning and read, that is, sight read, her paper to you. So Rosemary has very kindly sent the paper, but you will have to suffer listening to me read it. So let's begin. Rosemary Bancroft-Marcus, as you all know, is the prodigiously learned editor of Chortatsis, and the first volume of her giant Chortatsis for Oxford University Press appeared last year. The second volume, with all of the extra materials, is in preparation, at advanced stage of preparation. And here she ventures into the waters of Chortatsis in a different way, in a paper called The Cretan Pastor Fido: Can Translation Technique Prove Authorship by Chortatsis? So please excuse the stumblings and mistakes and other things which will render this paper about a tragicomedy more comic than it probably should be. So, the lyrical Cretan translation of Guarini's well-known Italian tragicommedia pastorale Il Pastor Fido, known as O Bistikos Voskos, has survived to the present day in a single very corrupt Heptanesian manuscript copy. The Cretan work would have been composed in the Latin script graphic system used by poets working in the literary vernacular. Our exemplar was probably a copy of a Greek script copy, possibly made from dictation. Even so, the original Cretan dialect shows through the Heptanesian dialect assimilations. The only modern edition is that of Pericles Ioannou, 1962, who deserves some credit for having done his best to make the sense of a very difficult exemplar. However, he failed to compare the Greek translation carefully with the Italian original, to which he makes only occasional reference. If he'd studied the correspondences in more detail, the sense of several incomprehensible passages would have become clear. This apart, Ioannou's edition is very bad, hard to read with pleasure. My attention, that is Rosemary's attention, was first drawn to the Cretan faithful shepherd by an interesting article by Niki Triantafylou-Theoridi, pointing out that a passage about courtesans in Chortatsis' comedy Katarpos draws inspiration from a passage in Guarini's play, and that the Greek vocabulary used there is almost identical to the rendering of that passage in O Bistikos Voskos. She believed that this might indicate common authorship. In other words, that the Cretan translation of Pastor Fido was none other than Chortatsis. I inclined from the first to the same conclusion, because the language of Bistikos Voskos struck me as extremely reminiscent of Chortatsis' plays and interludes, which I'd studied for my doctoral dissertation at Oxford in 1978. Later, in my trap to the pastoral mode in David Holton's Literature and Society in Renaissance Crete, 1991, I offered supporting evidence for identifying the author as Chortatsis. While living in California, I began work on a new reconstructive edition of Bistikos Voskos, but had to shelve that when I gained a contract with OUP to produce a bilingual edition of Chortatsis' plays. For Volume 2 of that edition, I've prepared an extensive glossary designed to represent Chortatsis' authentic Cretan idiolect. This involves sifting and screening out the spurious dialect and learned elements found in the textual witnesses and earlier modern editions, a tedious job both necessitated and facilitated by the fact that I was dealing with the whole known corpus rather than editing a single individual work. Until I'd compiled that glossary, I hadn't realized how very exactly the vocabulary of the whole of the Cretan faithful shepherd matches that of Chortatsis. There are very few words in Bistikos Voskos for which I haven't found corresponding examples or cognates in the works of Chortatsis. I now have much stronger grounds for regarding it as the work of that great Cretan playwright. This year, my priority is to complete the second companion volume of the Chortatsis edition, but once that's been submitted, I plan to resume work on a reconstructive bilingual edition of Bistikos Voskos, with the Greek text set opposite the Italian original. There'll be several emendations suggested by detailed comparison with the Italian original, and an attempt will be made to reconstruct its original linguistic form, which is, of course, the refined literary dialect in use around the turn of the 16th century by Chortatsis and Kornaros. Iorios Plumidis, director of the Istituto Ellenico in Venice, has promised to publish this if, and it is a big if, exclamation mark, I can manage to produce camera-ready copy. I might also append a very interesting 18th century English translation that I found in the Bodleian, far more faithful to the Italian than the better-known ironic and over-lewd rendering by Fanshawe. Such an edition might be of interest to students and scholars of three national literatures, Greek, Italian, and English. When preparing for the present talk, I set myself to look very hard at the way in which the Cretan author of Bistikos Voskos renders Guarini's Italian, not primarily for the sake of ementations, though some popped out, but to study how the author transformed the original into literary Cretan. Here, too, I found strong indications of the hand and mind of Chortatsis. His known plays and interludes include some passages of near quotation or translation from Italian literary works in which the techniques of notional transference into Cretan are demonstrably similar to those employed in the Cretan translation of Guarini's Pastor Fido. It is, in fact, not quite a translation, but a reworking of the Italian play, seemingly intended to render it performable on the Cretan stage, and that fact alone, those little touches which demonstrate experience of the live theatre, bring us back to Chortatsis. In certain passages, the Cretan author found it necessary to diverge from the Italian text in order to clarify the underlying sense or avoid misunderstanding. Guarini, a classicist and something of a pedant, tends to write in elliptical, impersonal style, using metaphors often obscure or untranslatable into Cretan. If the Greek poet had rendered these exactly, a reader who did not know the Italian original would have been puzzled to understand, and in some cases, the impression given by a literal translation into Cretan would have been so ludicrous as to arouse an audience to inappropriate laughter. The Greek translator prefers to render such passages more straightforwardly and more personally. Indeed, his lucid interpretations of the Italian are often quite helpful for our understanding of what Guarini was getting at. Quite frequently, where the Cretan author wanders away from the original, paraphrasing, developing, or bringing out the lyrical potential with the skillful use of rhyme, I found that the wording echoes passages in Chortatsis' known works, not just the vocabulary, but matching tricks of syntax and trades of psychology. The echoes come from all the genre attempted by that versatile author: pastoral, tragedy, comedy, and interlude. One could explain this as deep knowledge of those works in another author, but my overriding impression is that Chortatsis in such passages is unconsciously quoting or echoing himself, stimulated by earlier contexts, by similar contexts, to revert to motifs he'd worked on in earlier compositions. Chortatsis is often thought of as a somewhat dry author, especially in comparison with Kornaros, because of the relative complexity of his syntax, and partly because most readers approach him through his tragedy. Nevertheless, he had both a playful and a romantic side. The language he places in the mouths of lovers is highly Petrarchan, full of sweet endearments, hence Bunyalis' remark, "Kieka me tin panoria tu me zacharenia chili." But endearments exchanged by lovers are by no means lacking in the tragedy Erophili and the comedy Kazantzakis. The amorous speeches interspersed with kisses of the first two Erophili interludes contain a plethora of endearments, a feature not found in Chortatsis' source, Tassos Gerusalemme Liberata, especially Canto 16, where sensuality is suggested rather by description than by dialogue. Rinaldo, a valiant crusader, has left the battlefield to dally with Armida, a Saracen sorceress, in the enchanted island garden she has ordered her attendant demons to construct, a powerful metaphor of theatrical illusion. The two supposed lovers address each other in sugary terms, thus: "Psychimo che cardiamo, Rinaldo mo acrive, fos matia che psychimo, affendismo, Arminda mormo fotati, gliki che onostimo fili, loia glikosetemena, corimo, psychimo, neraidemo acrivi, Rinaldo agapimenemo, psychimo che cardiamo, cardiamo che psychimo." Of course, in context, these have an ironic ring, highlighting the depth of Rinaldo's amorous delusion. In an amusing scene in Guarini's Pastor Fido, Act 2, Scene 2, Dorinda, a gentle nymph, has found the beloved greyhound of cold-hearted Silvio, the boy she loves, but who thinks of nothing but hunting. She hides the dog, hoping to use it as a ploy to get him to return her love or give her a kiss. In the speeches ascribed to her in Bistikos Voskos, the translators had added extra little touches of Petrarchism, reproaches for Silvio's cruelty intermingled with loving endearments, neither of which are based on the wording of Guarini's play. So here, Sklirokardi, Kyaponos tistosi loik tiranasme, Skola se pethimiamo, sta hieria taglikya kitaponaso, Silvio mu agapimene glikota di cardiamo. Silvio uses similar lover's diction to coax her to return his dog, saying, for example, Dorinda mo acrivimo, but she knows his heart isn't in it. He claims indeed to have no idea what she wants from him. In desperation, she says in Pastor Fido, Te solo, Silvio, l'amor tuo vorrei. I want you alone, Silvio, and your love. This blunt demand becomes infinitely softer in the Cretan version. Ton potho to glikiso, keti glikiaso agapi, psychimo agapi meni, mucharise. She asked as recompense for returning his dog a kiss, to which Silvio in the Italian version grudgingly agrees, I son contento, whereas in the Cretan he makes her an explicit promise of at least one sweet kiss. But it's his dog Petritis who is showered with kisses upon the reunion, while Dorinda is forgotten. Eventually, at the end of Act 4, Dorinda achieves her heart's desire, but at the price of a painful arrow wound carelessly inflicted by Silvio, whose sudden volte-face in falling in love with her is to be ascribed both to Eros and to his shame at having hurt the innocent girl who has always loved him. Dorinda, in the Italian version, reproaches him almost with vengefulness. The Cretan author inserts into her speeches endearments which make her sound gentle and affectionate, rather like Athusa in Panoria. Psychimo, she says, tomorphasu hieria, to hierito gliki, psychimo agapimeni, stikos charitomeno kiomorphomo, referring to Silvio's breast, which is bared for her to shoot, instead of which she nestles against it. And this time when Silvio addresses her with tenderness, he means it. Dorindamo psychimo, corimo, chiaramo, amirisamo. This last rather unusual endearment has parallels in Erophili and the interludes. None of these sweet nothings has been translated from the Italian. Endearments are found in Pastor Fido, but far more sparsely. Just as the Italian text is supplemented in the Cretan version by added endearments, so too words expressive of pain, woe, and grief are supplied in appropriate context. Petrarchistic love diction, which seems to have remained fashionable in Crete for longer than in Italy, is full of vocabulary related to tears, sighs, pain, and fever. In Chortatsis' works, we find pain words applied either to the lovers, often in the first person, ego kaimenos, or to their hearts and bodies. Common adjectives are dolios, oxemenos, pligomenos, kaimenos, tyrannismenos, vasanismenos, and so on. The words kakos and asvolomenos are often ascribed to fate, irizigo, mira, and unlucky characters call themselves kakomiris, kakorizikos, and so on. The same phenomenon is found also in Bistikos Voskos. A single verse in Guarini's Italian, reading care me pene fortunati affanni, is expanded thus by the Cretan translator, who adds a graceful rhyme. Pathimu ke kaimi ke pasanamo, posa krivaki posa polame takarasas ifelahi stimpligomeni mesa tingardiamo. The first line recalls such passages as in Chortatsis as these lines from Panoria, Ket si potete nisa pathi kaigmi ke vasana sanisa tadikamo. In Act 5 of Panoria, where the priest is lamenting the necessity for him to sacrifice his own, in Act 5, the Pastor Fido, where the priest is lamenting the necessity for him to sacrifice his own son to save Arcadia, the verb piango becomes thrinume ke clego a kakomiris, and the Italian pronoun me becomes tokaimeno tokormimo. When a distraught father addresses his son who was sacrificial victim is vowed to silence, the Cretan version's far more touching and more natural than the stilted Italian. The Italian goes, "O sangue mio e tuan cor si crudo, che non risponde al tuo dolente padre. De padre o mai t'acqueta." Literally, "O my blood, are you so too cruel so as not to reply to your sorrowing father? O father, now quieten yourself." In Greek goes like this: "On ermamo che sarche che cardiamo, tosse che stisa lipitos emen, thom brica menon giriso, che udene logo de thamudosis pria pothanis, sgastia parivoriamo. Sopase kiri, sopase nazisis." Whoever the Cretan translator was, he undoubtedly excelled in pathos. Earlier in the play, an even more moving outburst by the heroine Eroprigusa, who's been unjustly condemned to death, has no parallel in the Italian source, and could have been placed in the mouth of Erofili. A difficulty in editing O Bistikos Voskos is to distinguish between accidental lacunae arising from faulty textual transmission and deliberate suppressions of material the Cretan translator might have found objectionable or inappropriate. In some cases, study of the Cretan text before and or after the gap shows up that the omission is unintentional on the part of the translator. In other cases, though, it could be deliberate. I sometimes sense a kind of moral squeamishness with regard to the darker aspects of the Italian work. The Greek poet seems to be jibbing against translating material which offended his sense of decency and verisimilitude, or which might be unacceptable in Cretan society. The omission of the final scenes of Acts 4 and 5 must be accidental. Many paper manuscripts lost their final pages or gathering. A purposeful omission, in my opinion, is that of the entirely redundant scene where Corridone, Corisca's spurned lover, appears on stage to justify his non-intervention in the action and goes off never to be seen or mentioned again. If performance was envisaged, one can well see why an actor-manager might have decided against including this superfluous role. Chortatsis found several motifs for his pastoral Panolia in Tasso's Aminta, but in his adaptation of one set of speeches, he mitigates the sting of a lengthy passage describing the torments to be suffered in sulphur-stinking hell by ungrateful women. All that remains is a single couplet threatening torments in Hades to those, sex unspecified, who refuse nature's call to marriage. Aputifisia dothiken asmigomen omavi, che opius difficil adica, pedreviet estonavi. The omission or toning down of passages of startlingly vehement misogyny in Guarini's Pastor Fido suggests to me that the Greek author, like Chortatsis, felt a natural distaste for this Italian literary topos. The satyr's invective against women's attempts to hide their natural defects is offensively nasty. I quote in English, "Oh, what an undignified and stomach-churning sight it is to watch you putting on your face paint." Contrast this with Panolia, where Frosini's remarks about women's attempts to beautify themselves make their airs and graces appear rather attractive, albeit silly. In Bistikos Voskos, the Cretan translator conveys the gist of the satyr's strictures without the gratuitous unpleasantness. He seems to me to be concerned specifically to avoid giving offence to women, thinking perhaps of their reaction as spectators to a live performance. Chortatsis' attitude to women was complex. Good women he praised and admired, creating in Princess Erofili a lady who, despite her secret marriage, comes across as idealistic, loving, courageous, and intelligent. A far cry from Giraldi's lustful, deceitful, and whining Orbecche, who avenges her father's murder of her children with the savagery of a mother animal deprived of her cubs. When Erofili's father angrily cries out against her attempt to justify her marriage with Panaritos, "Have you ever seen such boldness in a woman?" This is apokotia, a quality he prizes in himself. The counsellor reproves him by saying, "I have never seen such wisdom, agonosi." Chortatsis shows in his other known works a keen dislike of nagging wives and disapproval of female immorality, as exhibited by sorceresses, prostitutes, greedy and lying courtesans, though even then he points out that women may be driven into prostitution out of poverty. The Cretan poet of Bistikos Voskos seems to share Chortatsis' abhorrence of the impulse to wreak bloody and murderous vengeance. The whole of Erofili can be interpreted as an argument against vendetta, a perennial scourge of Cretan cities in his time, and his other plays and interludes too promote the ideal of reconciliation between warring parties. At the end of Act 3, Guarini's supposed faithful shepherd, believing that his lady-love has given her embraces to another, declares at considerable length his intention to waylay and stab her lover to death, thereby driving his repentant ex-lady-love to die of grief. This is a shockingly violent speech, more appropriate to the spleen of the horrid satyr than to a romantic amante disperato. I find it personally almost unbearable to read, and impossible to imagine how it could be acted in the Italian version without the audience losing all sympathy with the male lead. Very little of that speech remains in our extant version of Bistikos Voskos, just enough to convey Mirtillo's rapidly evolving emotions. I believe the missing parts of the Italian text here to be due not to an accident of textual transmission, but to a deliberate decision by the Cretan translator to suppress the excesses of this vengeful diatribe, which might almost serve to incite and justify real-life honour-killing. It's also extremely difficult to square Mirtillo's reaction on this occasion with his later heroism in offering to die in Erocritus's place. It breaks dramatic verisimilitude. The handling of metre in Bistikos Voskos is as expert as that of Chortatsis' works. Indeed, the preponderance of shorter 7-syllable lines, not used in his extant documented plays and interludes, serves to make more evident the metrical skills and idiosyncrasies we associate with Chortatsis. The Cretan translator, Pastor Fido, mainly follows Guarini's metrical scheme, mostly 7 syllables with some 11 syllables and some use of rhyme. The Greek poet uses rhyme more often and more skillfully for special emphasis or as a poetic clausula, a very pretty way to finish off a topic. There's a very significant metrical divergence from the Italian model in Act 3, Scene 2, Guarini's famous Ballo di Cieca, a choreographed and musical game of blind man's buff. The Italian dramatist was very proud of this scene, which alternates playful exclamations by the blindfolded heroine with formal chanted songs by the chorus of her girl companions as they dance around her, daring her to catch them. In Guarini's play, the songs are set in the usual loose distribution of 7 and 11-syllable lines, but rendered more formal by rhyming in pairs. The Cretan author, on the other hand, diverging much more from the text than is his usual wont, has composed what are effectively new songs in strict terza rima. Of course, the metre used in the 4 beautiful choric O's of Erophili. The sophisticated artistry underlying the Cretan version of the blind man's buff scene, which would in performance have featured dancing to musical accompaniment, is not only vastly superior to the Italian original, but is, in my view, very persuasive evidence of authorship by Chortatsis. And you can find, which I will skip on the handout, the first speech of that chorus. Guarini's Pastor Fido is unusually lengthy for its period, each of his acts being almost as long as an entire play. Though many of its scenes, tragical, comic, lyrical, are highly entertaining, the author's besetting faults of pedantry and prolixity make some scenes uncomfortably tedious. In performance, the audience could easily have become restless. The Italian play is fundamentally a literary experiment intended for classically educated readers, a modern satiric drama. It aroused great interest among the Italian reading public. Its merits and demerits were discussed in print long before its actual publication. But even though Guarini wanted it played on stage, actual performances were rare. The text presents real challenges for stage managers, requiring well-trained male and female choruses, a large but docile hunting dog, an actor to simulate Echo's replies to Silvio's questions, the satyr's laborious blocking of a cave mouth with a huge rock, and an elaborately dressed auteur for a scene of narrowly averted human sacrifice. The Cretan translation, by contrast, shows a far greater consciousness than the Italian of the original of the practical realities of performance. Comparison of the two reveals various adaptations, subtle or major, which seem designed to enhance the dramatic potential of the Italian work. The Greek dramatist doesn't always translate the text closely, sometimes exploiting it like a commedia dell'arte actor, fleshing out a scenario. He abbreviates Guarini's descriptions, removes redundancies and repetitions, clarifies elliptical utterances and clever chop logic, which spectators without access to the written text might have found obscure. He also removes details from descriptions of characters or actions that might have caused difficulty in performance, such as specifying stature and geographical layout, which might not be feasible on a particular stage. I believe that the manuscript that's come down to us stems from an authorial draft and not a completed autograph. The Greek author was considering changing the characters' names to make them more Cretan, Yipas Vasilio Agridis Montano, and the heroine Amaryllis is called throughout Erobrikusa, to bring out the wordplay on amore and amaro, love and bitterness. Elsewhere, perhaps he wished to avoid accidental comic associations with names. But the lack of prologue and choric odes is proof that what the Cretan playwright envisaged was not a literal translation of Guarini's play, but a creative adaptation for live performance in Crete, for which he had composed new peripheral material, including perhaps a dedication to a local patron. Perhaps one day a manuscript will turn up of a fully perfected, theatre-capable Bistikos Voskos, but it's not likely. Many works of inestimable quality would have been lost by the conflagrations and bombardments of the later Ottoman assault on the cities of Crete, and we should count ourselves fortunate to have at least the Heptanesian copy as testament to the existence of so notable a work. In view of the pains taken by the author of Bistikos Voskos to render the work suitable for a live audience, it's interesting to record that some sort of production of Guarini's play took place in Castro in 1611. A poem in its praise was composed by Andrea Kornaros, principal of the Stravaganti. Can we be sure, given that the encomium is in Italian, Andrea's normal choice, that this production was not of the Greek Bistikos Voskos? I've already suggested in a chapter of David Holton's Literature and Society in Renaissance Crete that the wording actively hints at a translation. It's already of interest, given the controversy over the role of the Cretan academies in sponsoring productions of the plays in the local Greek vernacular, that a Greek translation exists of a work performed in Iraklio named by the principal of its academy. Even if the production lauded by Kornaros was in fact of the Italian work, its Cretan Greek adaptation might have been commissioned and performed as a festival treat for ladies, few of whom spoke Italian. We've evidence for this possibility in the prologues to Chortatsis Panoria. The prologue of Joy is addressed to a general audience, whereas the prologue of Apollo contains complimentary allusions to the beauty and jewellery of an audience of fair spectators at a live performance. Guarini's Pastor Fido has several scenes of high comic value, especially where the satyr, angry because Corisca has rejected him for Coridone, catches her by the hair and threatens to ravish her. She succeeds in freeing herself because her braids are a wig. Before that, she drops her pretense of pleading pathetically for mercy and tells her goatish captor what she really thinks of him. In the Cretan version of this speech, I hear echoes of the comeuppance scenes in Chortatsis' comedy Kazantzakis. And again, on your handout, you've got the Italian original and the Greek text. And Corisca says, «O διάκριτε κοριάτη μισάνθρωποι μισοτραγοί για κέριο, ο ζόλ καταλυμμένο, τσιφίσεις ασκημιά του κόσμου ψέγος, αν είναι και πιστεύεις πως Corisca δεν σ' αγαπά, πιστεύεις την αλήθεια. Ποιο πράγμα θες εκείνη να αγαπήσω τη μούρη σου, για αυτήνα τα μαρολιπιασμένα σου τα γένια, για αυτά τα αυτιά του τράγου, για αυτό το βρωμισμένο, τόσο ξεδονιασμένο σου το στόμα, μάλιστα αυτό το σπήλιο γεμάτο τον αφρό. Κακή γυναίκα, τα λες αυτήνα, εσέ τα λέω εσένα, εμένα σκρόφα, εσέ κάπρο, εσένα». Strong stuff. The word marmarolipiasmena, applied to the satyr's beard, means disgustingly greasy, translating Guarini's sucida barba, meaning their simply filthy beard. The Cretan word marolipiasmena is an appropriately bucolic insult, derived from the oil or lanolin in a dirty sheep's fleece that stains a shepherd's or wool worker's hands and clothing. According to Kazantzakis, the form marolipos comes from chania, and is a distortion of the more correct maloripo, wool oil used by Rethymniots. A playwright from Rhethinon with Chaniot's patrons might well have come across the word in real life and found it funny enough to be memorable. Thank you.